In today's video, I'm going to discuss parallels in three scenarios related to well-known convicted criminals. The three cases involve the focus of this channel, Lucy Letby, Elizabeth Holmes of Theranos, and the infamous financial crook, Bernie Madoff. Before we go any further in this video, it's important for me to emphasise that I very strongly believe that Lucy Letby is innocent and has been the victim of an egregious miscarriage of justice, whereas it is undeniable that both Elizabeth Holmes and Bernie Madoff are guilty. But there is an intriguing parallel between the three cases that I wanted to discuss today, which was particularly prompted by the following viewer comment. I was asked by this viewer, or this viewer observed, what I find so difficult to understand is why the police did not realise what was going on. As the Lucy Letby case is the focus of this channel, this comment naturally relates to the situation regarding Cheshire Police, who seemingly very easily had the wool pulled over their eyes by both consultant paediatricians and then another retired paediatrician who worked on the investigation, namely Dr. Stephen Breary, Dr. Ravi Jairam and Dr. Dewi Evans. Now, I can entirely understand, considering the amount of trust that we invest in the police, and indeed the power that is invested in them as an organisation, why people may find it difficult to understand how they can be effectively so easily duped. And I was thinking about this question and how to answer it when I realised that both the cases of Theranos and Madoff actually underline and illustrate many of these issues quite succinctly. In order for me to demonstrate this, I firstly need to explain to you the story of Theranos. Theranos was a healthcare company that was initially phenomenally successful. It was founded in 2003 by Elizabeth Holmes, who was then just 19 years old. Theranos was able to raise over $700 million from venture capitalists and private investors, resulting in a peak valuation in excess of $9 billion. At the heart of this enormous valuation was a claim from Theranos, largely driven by Elizabeth Holmes, who became something of a media figure, that the company could perform an enormous range of medical tests with just one pinprick of blood. In order to do this, it utilised proprietary technology named after legendary inventor Thomas Edison, which it called the Edison machine or device. Now, the advantages of being able to perform a huge range of tests from one small capillary sample are numerous. It would enable much easier, less invasive sampling. Finger pricks or heel pricks are far less painful and intimidating than the drawing of blood via venous methodology, so more people would be able to accept testing. It would also make it much easier for children, elderly patients, and those who have a phobia of needles. Additionally, this sort of testing can be done almost anywhere. If you could run dozens of tests on a tiny sample, clinics, pharmacies, and possibly even homes could get near instant results instead of sending tubes to some distant laboratory. That would mean faster diagnosis, faster treatment decisions, and presumably better outcomes. Tiny samples would also reduce the total amount of blood taken from patients who need frequent monitoring. In intensive care units, dialysis clinics, or neonatal wards, repeated venous draws add up very quickly. Microvolume testing would theoretically dramatically reduce the risk of blood loss from testing itself. Another advantage is that smaller samples could simplify logistics. There would be less equipment, fewer test tubes, and the possibility of mailing dried blood spots without refrigeration can make widespread screening easier and cheaper, especially in remote or low-resource settings. This would then have the knock-on effect of expanding access. Many communities don't have trained phlebotomists or full laboratories. If healthcare workers could use a simple finger prick to run reliable tests, public health programs for conditions such as infectious diseases or metabolic disorders would reach far more people. And finally, if you can get lots of information from merely a tiny drop, it would become much easier to do frequent monitoring. regular checks for glucose, inflammation markers, or therapeutic drug levels would suddenly become far less burdensome. But then comes the hard part. Why is it so difficult to achieve this at scale, and indeed, why has this still not been achieved to this day? 1. Many lab tests simply require more blood than Theranos was promoting. They need enough volume to run the assay, control for error, and sometimes rerun the sample. Trying to squeeze dozens of tests out of a single drop is a massive engineering challenge. 2. Capillary blood, the kind that you would acquire from a fingerprint, isn't the same as venous blood. The composition differs slightly, which means results can shift, and every test needs to be validated specifically for capillary samples. 3. Tiny samples are extremely sensitive to pre-analytical errors. If the blood clots even a little, if the finger is squeezed too hard, or if the drop is slightly diluted with tissue fluid, the results can be seriously skewed. Small errors matter a lot with a tiny sample. 4. Some analytes exist in extremely low concentrations. To measure them reliably, you often need larger volumes or highly sensitive equipment. Trying to detect these markers in microliter samples increases the risk of false negatives or inconsistent readings. Of course, we know all about that from the Lucy Letby case. 5. Many tests require plasma or serum, not whole blood. That normally means centrifuging the sample or adding stabilizers. Doing that accurately with very small amounts of blood, especially at the point of care, is highly complicated. 6. If you want to run lots of tests at once, you need multiplexing, but that introduces the risk of interference and cross-reactivity between assays. The more tests you pack into a small device, the harder it becomes to ensure that they don't affect each other. 7. Clinical labs need strict quality control and calibration. Every one of these tiny sample assays must prove its accuracy, precision, and stability. Again, something we know about from the Lucy Letby case. Achieving that level of reliability across dozens of tests is extremely difficult, and regulators naturally require strong evidence before approving any of it. And finally, even if you measure the analytes correctly, interpreting the results can be tricky. Capillary blood may need different reference ranges, and higher variability increases the risk of false positives or false negatives, which can lead to real-world harm. Again, we know about that from the Lucy Letby case. So what Theranos and Elizabeth Holmes were trying to do was achieve something extraordinary. And I'm certainly not an expert on Holmes, but I do think she genuinely wanted to make her mark and be involved with something groundbreaking and transformational. I think it's also true that there was definitely greed there, as we will see later in this video with Madoff, but I do think there was a genuine ambition and desire to build something revolutionary that would make a difference. Of course, it should be emphasised that Holmes was completely reliant on lab technicians. She had attended Stanford University, where she studied chemical engineering and worked as a student researcher and laboratory assistant in the School of Engineering, later working in a lab at the Genome Institute of Singapore. But there was also an enormous amount of hubris, and eventually she demonstrated weaknesses in her character that could be reasonably described as sociopathic. Regardless of this, what Holmes was attempting to achieve with Theranos was extraordinarily difficult from a technical perspective, and yet, conversely, it was almost impossible for her to understand whether or not it was even achievable. But she was quite clearly a very convincing and capable saleswoman because she convinced a lot of very powerful and successful people. Among the investors in Theranos were the Walton family, the founders of Walmart, who invested $150 million. Rupert Murdoch, the media mogul, invested over $120 million. The DeVos family, headed by former US Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos, invested $100 million. Cox Enterprises, the family that owns the media and automobile company, also invested $100 million. Larry Ellison, the Oracle co-founder and former CEO, was an early investor in Theranos. Carlos Slim, a Mexican business tycoon, invested approximately $30 million. Andreas Dracopoulos, the co-president of the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, personally invested $25 million. Robert Kraft, the owner of the New England Patriots, invested $1 million. And finally, Walgreens, the pharmacy chain that is very successful in the United States, invested $140 million in a partnership with Theranos. And then sitting on the board at Theranos were George Shultz, the former US Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, the former US Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, William Perry, a former US Secretary of Defense, James Mattis, retired Marine Corps General, later the US Secretary of Defense, Sam Nunn, a former US Senator, Richard M. Kovacevic, a former CEO and chairman of the bank Wells Fargo, and William Ferger, former director of the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. There was also quite an infamous instance in which Holmes appeared on stage with Bill Clinton, who praised her glowingly. I just mentioned Walgreens, the American pharmacy chain, and in November 2014, Theranos agreed a deal with Walgreens that would see their proprietary technology installed in Walgreens stores. Elizabeth Holmes was riding the crest of a wave at this time, and we can see in the media of the time claims being repeated that would later disintegrate. As an example, this article from Engadget notes that Holmes dropped out of Stanford at 19 years old to build Theranos, devised a way to perform up to 70 different blood tests using just 25 to 50 microliters of blood. The startup seriously needs so little blood from patients that all it takes to draw a sample is a nearly painless finger prick. Plus, the minuscule vial it uses to keep blood is called a nanotainer, which you can barely see in the image above. Even better, the company has vowed to keep its prices below 50% of Medicare's reimbursement rate for each product. With Theranos testing kits available in ever more Walgreens, people can just walk in, get their finger pricked, get results to their doctors within hours, and save a ton of money in the process. So we're going to park Theranos there at the height of the company's success and now examine Bernie Madoff. I assure you that this will all come back to the Lucy Letby case, but we need to go through some case studies of these two individuals first. Madoff was a successful financial entrepreneur, being involved in Wall Street from the beginning of his working career and having a prestigious position as a market maker and pioneer in financial technology. Now, I'm not going to enter into all of the technical aspects of this because it's not really important to the story. The point is that at some point, Madoff decided to initiate what became the biggest Ponzi scheme ever devised and executed. For those who don't know, a Ponzi scheme is a type of financial fraud in which early investors are paid returns not from legitimate profit, but from the money contributed by newer investors. Similar to a pyramid scheme in many ways. The scheme creates the illusion of a successful, profitable investment, but no real revenue-generating activity exists to sustain it. What Madoff did is still one of the craziest things I've ever encountered in my life. He attracted investment from wealthy investors and told them that he was investing their money in the stock market, but he never actually made a single trade. All of the effort in this business went into creating false statements that had theoretical trades that were created after the market had already moved. So Madoff could make it look like he had made all the right moves because he was able to act after the event had happened. But in reality, he never invested any money at all. So all the time his investors were receiving statements believing that their capital was growing, when in reality the amount of capital that Madoff had was diminishing because he sometimes had to pay off investors. He was living a very lavish lifestyle himself, and as there is absolutely no investment of capital, there is no way to pay this. He was simply robbing Peter to pay Paul. The advantage of doing this is that Madoff could obviously provide what appeared to be very reliable, very consistent growth to investors. That's not difficult to do when you're just making up the numbers, although it did become an increasingly complex logistical task as the scheme got bigger and bigger. There was a gentleman known as Harry Markopoulos who very early on recognised that what Madoff was doing was impossible. You just can't continue to generate 10% profits from investment year after year after year with no failures. It's just not possible. Even a machine can't do this today. Everyone has ups and downs. He was asked to reverse engineer what Madoff was doing, and Markopoulos very quickly realised that it was mathematically and fiscally impossible. He actually wrote to the Securities and Exchange Commission, often abbreviated to SEC, which is the regulator of the financial industry, on 3 separate occasions. The first time, by his own admission, his letter was a little bit speculative. But I've read the second submission that he made to the SEC, and I would know from reading that letter, and I'm not financially trained, but I know a little bit about trading, how finance works and economics. I would know from that letter that what he was saying was legitimate, just based on one point alone, which is that the volume of trading that Madoff was claiming to do would have to move the market. It's one of the basic rules of the financial markets. If there's a large volume of trading, you see an impact on the market itself. It's natural if you invest a large amount of capital, the market moves. But that never happened, despite an extraordinary volume of claimed trading from Madoff. Of course, the reason that the market didn't move is because none of those trades were ever made. Now, on that point alone, the SEC should have been able to investigate, but they completely failed. Markopolos spoke to them 3 times, and they never managed to respond adequately. The scheme only collapsed when, inevitably, Madoff ran out of money. I won't go into the whole story surrounding the Madoff family. There are many excellent documentaries about this, but it was very sad and truly tragic. One of his sons committed suicide. His wife actually tried to commit suicide but failed. His other son died of cancer a few years after this, while Madoff himself was still in prison. It had a very immediate impact on his family, and of course it had an enormous impact on the investors, who all thought they had an enormous amount of money, when in fact they had nothing. In today's video Now, we've seen with Theranos the status of people involved. Exactly the same applies to Madoff. You can see a list of them on the screen now. So you have Fairfield Sentry, a US investment firm, a feeder fund. I won't go into explaining exactly what a feeder fund is, but they're heavily involved in the financial industry. They lost $7.5 billion. Grupo Santander, everyone's heard of them, Spanish bank, they're on the high street. They lost $3.5 billion. Kinggate Management, another feeder fund and a hedge fund, they lost $3.5 billion. Rye Investment, another hedge fund, they lost $3.1 billion. Bank Medici of Austria, an Austrian bank, they lost $2.8 billion. Another hedge fund, Ascot Partners, and then a further hedge fund, Access International Advisors, they collectively lost $3.2 billion. Fortis Bank of the Netherlands, they lost $1.35 billion. Thema Fund, an Irish hedge fund, lost over $1 billion. HSBC, an absolute household name, one of the best known banks in the world, possibly the best known bank in the world, lost $1 billion. And then 3 further Swiss banks lost collectively over $2 billion between them. And so it goes on. There were many, many others. So both Theranos and Madoff managed to trick some very wealthy and established people and companies. What's interesting is that the most clued up people were not taken in the case of Theranos. Many traditional venture capital firms avoided investing due to the company's extreme secrecy and unwillingness to share information for proper due diligence. And it was similarly notable that none of the big investment banks were invested in the Madoff operation. The board at Theranos indeed drew criticism for its lack of medical and technology experts, with most members having backgrounds in government and public policy. Many of the influential political figures were recruited through George Shultz's connections at the Hoover Institution. In February 2015, Stanford professor John Ioannidis wrote in the Journal of the American Medical Association that no peer-reviewed research from Theranos had been published in medical research literature. In May 2015, University of Toronto professor Eleftherios Diamandis analysed Theranos technology and concluded that most of the company's claims are exaggerated. Attempting to boost the credibility of Theranos, Holmes invited then US Vice President Joe Biden to tour their facility. Biden praised what he saw, but to conceal the laboratory's true operating conditions, Holmes had created a fake laboratory for the tour of the Vice President. We will later see similar things occurring with Madoff. In October 2015, John Carreyrou of the Wall Street Journal reported that Theranos was using traditional blood testing machines instead of the company's Edison devices to run its tests, and that the company's Edison machines might provide inaccurate results. At this time, media was really beginning to investigate Theranos, and indeed one journalist had a cholesterol test taken at the company which was proven to be wildly inaccurate. Theranos claimed that the allegations were factually and scientifically erroneous, but Walgreens suspended plans to expand blood testing centres in their stores following the report. At that time, the Cleveland Clinic announced that it would work to verify Theranos technology. Theranos fought back against the Wall Street Journal's investigation, sending lawyers after sources in the story, including Schultz, in an effort to stop them from providing information to the press. Following the Wall Street Journal story, the History of Food and Drug Administration interactions, this organisation often abbreviated to FDA, with Theranos was scrutinised. The FDA had received a formal inquiry to look at Theranos blood test devices by the US Department of Defense in 2012, before the devices being made commercially available, and therefore they never required FDA approval. FDA inspection reports from 2014 and 2015 stated the containers that Theranos used for blood collection were not validated under actual or simulated use conditions and were not reviewed or approved by designated individuals prior to issuance. From there, everything unravelled. Theranos faced further action from government agencies, and in May 2016, Theranos announced that it had voided 2 years of results from its Edison device. Within 2 weeks, Walgreens formally terminated its partnership with Theranos and would close all remaining Theranos wellness centres. I won't go through the whole sorry collapse of this company, but it went from being valued at $9 billion to literally zero. Not only that, but some very dangerous things clearly occurred, as Theranos never had working technology that met regulatory standards. The company was a phantom built on dust, just as the $65 billion fund of Bernie Madoff was actually worth literally nothing. What both of these stories have in common is that a lot of extremely successful and in some cases quite sophisticated people were duped and lost an enormous amount of money. So at this point, I'd like to return to the Lucy Letby case and the question of how the police could be taken in. As my viewer put it, how could they not realise what was going on? Now, I would like viewers at this point to consider the sophistication of Paul Hughes and Nigel Wenham compared to the board of Theranos and investors in both Theranos and Madoff. Clearly, I think everyone would agree there is no comparison, and yet all of those investors were misled. They all found themselves taken in by something which had no solidity or even foundation. Once you know that, it should be obvious that Cheshire Police can be taken in by doctors. Now, the motivations are slightly different in the three scenarios because there is clearly a lot of greed mixed up with Theranos and Madoff. But there are several principles that unite the three cases. The first and most important one is that those who were fooled in each of these three scenarios share one common characteristic. They had no knowledge in that field. I suppose you could argue that with Madoff, he did manage to convince banks to invest in his Ponzi scheme. But it's notable in today's video that investment banks who really understood the market, who really understood trading and investing, were indeed not invested in the Madoff enterprise. Similarly, those invested in Theranos and the people sitting on the board had no medical knowledge whatsoever. And we also know how much medical knowledge Cheshire Police had in their possession. Now we're hearing from real experts in Lucy's case, and it's not quite so easy to pull the wool over their eyes. That's the first thing. The second thing is that we're dealing with people who have a degree of status and authority. Now there's a big difference obviously between the calibre of people involved in Theranos, between these big banks and big investors with Madoff and with Cheshire Police. But of course the police do have a degree of power and influence invested in them by their very nature, and most people in most walks of life will never experience that level of power. So I think there are very clear parallels there as well. That moves us on to the third part, ego. Typically, and I would say particularly men, when they achieve a certain level of status, respect, and so on, their egos can grow quite disproportionate to their actual ability. I'm sure that would apply to those invested in both Theranos and Madoff. While the police are used to getting respect, and they also often, I would imagine, misinterpret people being scared of them as respect. Now, if you put those three things together, status, ego, and lack of knowledge, that is a very dangerous combination. Because what you will typically find with people who have those characteristics is that they don't particularly like admitting that they're wrong, and they like to be seen as knowledgeable or at the very least as competent. They don't like to admit that someone else understands something much better than they do. They wouldn't wish to have to concede that they don't intellectually understand something. So I'm sure you can see from that inference how it would be possible for the police to not understand what's going wrong, because they don't really understand the case. They don't understand the medical aspects of the case, hence they have repeatedly conveyed aspects of the supposed evidence in the Lucy Letby case which have been routinely dismissed by qualified people. The most obvious example of this is they always repeat this claim that you always know when a neonate is going to collapse. But across the three cases, you're dealing with different people from different worlds, but what they all very much have in common is an inability to admit that they don't really understand what they're dealing with. And then when you couple that with a total lack of knowledge and actual understanding, you have very dangerous scenarios. And each of these three situations were calamitous. In the case of Theranos, we ended up in a situation in which Elizabeth Holmes pushed these machines into pharmacy centres where when they were completely unable to deliver what they were supposed to do. There could have been incredibly serious consequences for patients. Holmes, in my opinion, is in fact incredibly fortunate that she's only serving 11 years in prison. Bernie Madoff spent the rest of his life in prison. He's dead now. Every investor in the Madoff Ponzi scheme lost all of their money, and there had to be an enormous investigation to try and rake some of that money back. I think, frankly, they did a pretty extraordinary job to find approximately 75% of it. But a lot of people lost a lot of money. Some committed suicide. His family were completely ruined. Both of his sons died at a young age. It was a very, very grave and dark situation. And in the case of Lucy Letby, the police ran an utterly incompetent investigation. The more we look into it, the more clear it becomes how shambolic it was and how little they understood what they were doing. Eventually that case was pushed to court. It resulted in the unsafe conviction of the very obviously innocent Lucy Letby, and now the police are scrabbling around trying to pretend that what they've done is legitimate and to cover their own arses, essentially. We even have this phenomenon of the sunk cost fallacy, where the more someone is invested in something that is failing, the more they cling onto it in the hope that it will somehow turn around. One of the interesting things about Theranos is that the grandson of George Shultz was one of the people who exposed the company. And when he did this initially, George Shultz was very resistant. He essentially dismissed what his grandson was saying because of all the reasons I've just described, all the vanity that comes from that. He believed that he was right, and he believed that his grandson was wrong because of his status, his success, and so forth. So he was willing to completely dismiss the idea that his grandson could possibly be correct. His grandson was actually very knowledgeable in these topics. How could he possibly be right, though? How could his grandson know more than the great George Shultz, admittedly about a subject in which George Shultz had no training, no qualifications, no knowledge, no credentials? And of course, the grandson was completely correct and George Shultz was completely incorrect. So when you consider the matter of how Cheshire Police could get this so spectacularly wrong, how they could not understand what was going on, how they could have the wool pulled over their eyes so easily, please be advised that it's not as difficult as you might imagine. And then another important aspect of this is compartmentalisation. The police in the Lucy Letby case lived in a bubble where they were only hearing information that pointed towards guilt. That was a major contributing factor towards the confirmation bias which very obviously riddled their investigation. In modern parlance, the phrase that is often used to express this is an echo chamber. But I think essentially it's just a bubble where you only receive one version of reality or one version of a particular issue, and you can therefore become very convinced of the legitimacy of that perspective, particularly when it's continually reinforced. We actually see that across all of these cases. So in the case of Theranos, they were growing enormously. They had all of these big investors. They had some very credentialed people on the board. They've got Elizabeth Holmes appearing on TV all the time, so it would be very easy for them to believe that it's all true. In actual fact, they didn't even have a working machine. In the case of Madoff, you have this enormous amount of investment in his company. Tens of billions were invested, and the theoretical value of the whole scheme was $65 billion. Then you have all of these big names. Of course, Madoff himself is highly regarded on Wall Street. He's involved with all these regulatory commissions. He was instrumental in the creation of the Nasdaq share index and certain aspects of electronic trading. He was a market maker. Again, he's in the media all the time. So there is no reason for people, even on the inside, to smell a rat. And indeed, even his own sons didn't know what was happening. They worked in the same building, but on a different floor. Madoff compartmentalized his whole fraudulent operation. He had what was a genuine trading operation, some sort of financial business operating on a lower floor of the building, and he compartmentalized this enormous Ponzi scheme. I think it was on the 17th floor of the building, and no one was allowed access to that floor other than the few key employees who helped him run the whole thing and helped dupe people for literally decades. And then when investors visited Madoff, he would walk them through the small-scale legitimate business, which looked very impressive superficially, but was really just a front for fraud. Exactly the same thing that Holmes did. Holmes took people on tours of Theranos that appeared superficially convincing, but she was actually just gaslighting them. And then with the police in the Lucy Letby case, while they quite obviously could have done a much better job when it came to running the investigation, the way that it was conducted, was they had two paediatricians pointing to Lucy Letby, which was Brewery and J-Ram. They then had Dr. Dewi Evans pointing to Lucy Letby. Then once they begin the investigation, all of what they believe to be evidence is coming forward, all pointing to the same thing, because it's cherry-picked. And as this occurs, they become more and more convinced. So then you have the murmurings going around the police station. In the section of the Operation Hummingbird film that we've already assessed, it's clear that they all became intoxicated by this investigation. They became emotionally involved. So then that just ramps things up further. And pretty soon they're just living in a bubble of this being a horrendous crime, and they just shut out any other possibilities. And then the other aspect of this is that in each of the three cases there's a very compelling narrative. In the Madoff case, he seduced investors by presenting his fund as this very exclusive thing that was very difficult to get into. He pretended as if he was almost reluctant for people to invest in the fund because he really didn't need the money, whereas, of course, in reality, the complete opposite was the case. In the Theranos case, you have the situation where they're trying to create history. They're trying to create this sophisticated medical equipment that can achieve something that's never been done before and that will be genuinely transformative. And then in the Lucy Letby case, you're dealing with this crime that is enormous. It's clearly the biggest case that Cheshire Police have ever dealt with. It's tragic, obviously, that they've done such an abysmal job, but it's a very compelling story, of course, as well, because of the infants. There's nothing more emotional than hearing that infants have lost their lives and been harmed, and so on. So in each of the three cases, it's easy to get sucked into this bubble because of the compelling nature of the narrative. It's important to remember at the heart of these three stories is the same parallel. It's all built on sand. Theranos doesn't have a working machine. Madoff doesn't have a financial fund. And this supposedly massive criminal investigation of Cheshire Police doesn't actually involve any crimes. What started as three very different scandals, Theranos, Bernie Madoff's Ponzi scheme, and the Lucy Letby investigation, end up exposing the same structural and psychological vulnerabilities. In each case, we see a powerful combination of technical or domain complexity that most outsiders cannot assess, status and authority that confer credibility, compartmentalization and secrecy that hide what's really happening, and ego, sunk costs, and compelling narratives that shut down healthy skepticism. And in each case, this then becomes a substitute for evidence or proof. Theranos illustrates this particularly well. Elizabeth Holmes sold a revolutionary, technically ambitious idea, dozens of tests from a single finger prick of blood, to people who wanted to believe the future had already arrived. The science and engineering hurdles were enormous. tiny sample volumes, capillary versus venous blood differences, sensitivity to pre-analytic errors, multiplexing issues, and the demands of clinical quality control. Yet an aura of disruption, celebrity endorsements, and influential board members created an echo chamber that drowned out the most basic question: did the technology actually work? When investigative reporting and regulators finally pushed, the house of cards rapidly collapsed, with real risk to patients along the way. Madoff shows the same pattern in finance. It should have been obvious that the returns were too consistent to be legitimate, and there were enormous red flags. Perceptive experts raised both fiscal and mathematical alarms and warned regulators, but institutional inertia and deference to reputation delayed action fatally. Madoff compartmentalized operations and curated a narrative of exclusivity that discouraged broader scrutiny. The result wasn't just financial loss, it was devastation to families and ultimately trust in the entire financial system. Our primary focus on this channel, the Lucy Letby case, is another example of those dynamics with regard to the investigation, not because the players are identical, but because the mechanisms are. Here, investigators operated inside a bubble, expert testimony that was selectively presented, confirmation bias amplified by emotional investment, and an institution that was unwilling or unable to probe outside of its own narrative. Holmes and Madoff were guilty, whereas Lucy was convicted after an investigation vulnerable to the same failings that fooled investors and regulators elsewhere. If there's a single lesson from this, it's a practical one. Authority is not a substitute for competence. We must pair deference with technical verification and independent challenge. Systems need transparency, whistleblower pathways that are heard rather than dismissed, and structural safeguards that prevent compartmentalization. Individuals, whether investors, regulators, or police officers, need the humility to admit what they don't know and the courage to ask hard technical questions even when they grate against the prevailing and compelling narrative. When credibility is misplaced, people are harmed, patients misdiagnosed, people financially ruined, and in the most serious cases, lives and liberty are at stake. Describing these cases as being built on sand isn't melodramatic. It's a call to rebuild institutions around evidence rather than reputation. We must demand independent expertise, carefully consider dissenting evidence, and recognise how human incentives and vulnerabilities such as ego, power, pride, greed, vested interest, institutional resistance, and fear of embarrassment can warp decision-making. If you take away one thing from this video, let it be this: compelling stories can blind even the smartest people. It goes without saying that this risk is amplified when less intelligent people are involved. I hope you have enjoyed this slightly different look at the Lucy Letby case. I thought this would be an interesting way to illustrate how things can spiral out of control in a police investigation, even with the best of intentions, and how it's surprisingly easy for people to become deceived by a compelling narrative that serves a particularly seductive worldview. As a final thought, I happened upon a YouTube channel called Bull and Thread, in which the video maker had ironically explained some of the most important cognitive biases involved in the Lucy Letby case: the Texas sharpshooter fallacy, authority bias, the illusory truth effect, and how and why stories fool even smart people. In my next video, we will examine the briefing document that was sent by Dr. Stephen Breary to Cheshire Police in May 2017.